Okay, guys. So this is the second class. It's a recorded session because we were not able to meet. So now, basically, what we're going to be talking about in this video is the positive and negative impacts of the European exploration. So we have been talking about the colonization of the Native American empires and the arrival of England, Spain, France, and even the Dutch to some point, and how they have colonized the America in this time or in this part of history. And then now what we want to do is what happened after the colonization happened. What happened to the Native Americans and what happened to the Europeans? And what was the impact that this exploration had on these groups of people? So, first, we want to talk about some positive impacts. So, when we talk about the exploration, most people think that, okay, they came to the Americas and then this and this happened, and we only sometimes think about the bad things. But in regards to the colonization and exploration on behalf of the European, it did have positive impacts. But the question we should ask is positive impacts for whom exactly? So now the first positive impact was introduction of new trading routes. So now what does that mean? When we talk about new routes, it's basically if we remember the beginning of how colonization happened and exploration took place in the first instance, and talking about Christopher Columbus, he was basically looking for something somewhere, new routes, trying to find India. And we recall that it was that he had stated that he was looking for India. So when he landed here, to him, he thought that he was in the West Indies, right? The European arrival in North America opened even more new trading routes. So even though he realized some point after, okay, this is not India, but we found somewhere else, then he decided, okay, we can find new routes from Europe to these islands or to the Americas. And from the Americas, they decided to create different routes. And as you can see in the diagram, there were different passages that they had developed to be able to travel from the Americas to Europe. These trading routes tended to be one-sided, right? So it was fair to say, to some extent, the people of North and South America did not reap the benefits of the new trading routes. So because the routes were intended basically only for the Europeans, so the Europeans used them and they were able to see, okay, this is where we can get this resource, this is where we can get this resource, and this is how we can take it back, and the easiest route for them, right, when it comes to imports and exportations. The other factor is European economic growth. So, what it means directly, European economic growth. It was the economic growth and the wealth of the Europeans. And talking about all of them, England, Spain, France, the Dutch, all of them had this positive impact where, because they were developing new routes and they had imports and exports and they have all of these factors, then automatically that gave them a result that, okay, I am going to be having more revenue. The other factor is increase in political power, and we saw this when we talked about the 4Gs. They wanted glory, they wanted power, and newfound wealth. So all of these positive impacts are linked one to the other. If they have new trading routes, they have more money, and because they have more money, they have more power, political power between Portugal, England, the Netherlands, Spain, all of these different European countries. They were competing for power, right? And it is important that we stress that the impact was only positive for the Europeans, because the Europeans were getting these positive impacts, and we're not really talking about positive impacts for the Native Americans, because the positive impacts are very one-sided, just as the negative impacts were one-sided as well, and we're going to see that in a little bit. um, so let's continue with the. So this is the increase in the political power, and especially political. Back then, we even had a question in one of our activities where politics was related to religion, and they co-worked. And basically, in that time, religion was power. If you were in the religion, you had power. And finally, our last positive impact is new innovation. So, what does new innovation means? Today, it means that we have the latest technology that has come up. Back then, it also meant technology, but technology in their own form, or technology of that time. The need for technology for boats to travel further and safer drove numerous inventions during that period. So that was something that was very big. They were using boats to travel, so they were investing, and they were creating and using their wealth to make and to improve the technology that they already have, so that it was like an investment. You invest so that in the future that investment doubles in your revenue, or even triples sometimes. You even had the compass rose and the magnetic compass that allowed sailors to know what direction they were traveling in. Most people back then, they didn't have a compass rose, or they didn't have a magnetic compass. So then that was something that was keeping them behind, or it, to some extent, didn't allow them to travel as fast as they would travel, because they had to be following from the stars, or landing on one island and they know that the other island is in this direction, or estimating from the sun, because the sun rises in one hemisphere and sets in the other hemisphere. So all of those things were ways how um they were figuring out how to travel. But once they had the compass and even the magnetic compass, they were able to easily figure out what direction to go. Now we go into the negative impacts. What were the negative impacts? And again, we asked the question, who or whom did the negative impacts happen to? Specifically of the European colonization of that time. And if the positive impacts were for the Europeans, automatically, then the negative impacts were directly upon the Native Americans of that time. And the first one is disease. So, why disease? Because the Europeans brought diseases with them, diseases that were not found here in the Americas, right? And these diseases were very fatal to the Maya, to the Inca, to the Aztecs, so all of these Native Americans, because we didn't have those diseases here. If the Mayas suffered from any disease, which they did, I'm not saying that they didn't suffer from no kind of disease. It might be something very minor, like a fever, a cough, something like that. But when the Europeans came, they brought these very sophisticated diseases like smallpox, they brought syphilis, they brought measles, and they brought other diseases that the Maya had never experienced before. And it was like when their people contracted it, they were like, "What is all of this?" Talking about smallpox, what were these things that were growing on their skin, right? And same thing with measles, when they had these red spots coming out on all over their skin, they didn't know what it was. And when you talk about syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, they were like, they did not have these things, and it was like shocking to them. And because they did not have any experience with them, and because they were slaves to the Europeans didn't even bother to tell them, okay, you know what, if they had interracial sexual relationships with the European and a Maya, they had intercourse, and the European transmitted syphilis to the Maya. And that was how all of these things started to spread, because the Maya didn't know what it was. And when they started getting symptoms, they panicked, because like, what is this? First time that they're seeing something like this. All right. Because of certain biological and cultural reasons, the disease tore through the population. And what I'm saying, they didn't know what it was. If, for example, smallpox, which is related to chickenpox but a little bit more severe, and when one caught it, that is very contagious, and that spread. And if it's not um, tended to, then it leads to people dying. Same thing with measles. measles if it's not tended to. Right now, when you guys are babies, and you can ask your parents about when you guys get vaccinated, to give a measles vaccination, because a measles is very deadly. If you, and it leads to other diseases like pneumonia, and these things that lead to death. um, the common practice of visiting the sick made it extra contagious, while a lack of immunity made it extra deadly. So now, what is that saying basically is that in the Maya culture, if somebody had smallpox or somebody got sick, it was in the culture that, family would go and visit, people of the village would go and visit, and that is how it spread and spread and spread to more people, because Maya were not educated to some point in knowing what this was. Our second negative impact was the Atlantic slave trade. Now, the Atlantic slave trade basically was slavery in simple layman terms, and this was slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery where slaves were taken from Africa, were taken from the Americas, and they were being transported to different places. Um, Instead of meditating on the death and destruction they caused, Europeans power enslaved Africans to replenish their dying workforce. So, because they were killing so many Mayas and so many Incas and so many Aztecs over on this side of the Americas, they said, okay, our people, our workforce is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so we have to do something else, find a replacement. And that's why they started to bring Africans as slaves, and that is how the slavery started, because the Mayas were dying out, the Incas were dying out, and all of these Native Americans were dying out because of the harsh treatment that they were getting. And this was how slavery had started for the Africans here in the Americas. Corruption in colonies. Now, this was something um, more on the European side, but it had severe impacts on the Native Americans. And if you guys remember when we saw the video on Christopher Columbus, where Christopher Columbus at some point started getting, the power started going to his head. He started mistreating the people. He started doing corrupt things in the colonies that he was in charge of. And even his brothers, when he left, because the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella called him for his trial to give an explanation as to why these things are happening, his brothers Bartholomew and the other one were the same thing, and even worse to some point, where this corruption was just causing them to have a very chaotic colony, and by consequence everybody was suffering. Native Americans were suffering, and even the Europeans that lived in that, the colonists that were there, were suffering as well. And then the last one is demolish cultures leading to genocide. So this one, I think, is the final negative impact, the biggest negative impact, where if we talk about the Olmecs was a race that basically vanished because of the same thing, where the Europeans demolished this entire culture, this entire tribe empire, and it led to the genocide of that culture, meaning that they destroyed it completely. Nobody knows how many people died from these European plagues. Nobody can really say, okay, we have this estimated figure, but we can't say exactly, but this was the correct amount of how many people died when the Europeans brought their diseases, when the Europeans brought their war, and they were killing people, and they were putting them into slavery and all these things. Nobody can say exactly how many people died. And to make it even worse, it was a common practice to enslave the native population. And in the Caribbean, Spain worked thousands to death in mines and fields. So the only way that you stopped working in this case for Spain and under these Spaniard colonists were if you died. So imagine working yourself, working day and night, working until you die, and you die right there where you are working in the fields or in the mines, and then they're just gonna take you out and throw you like garbage. Can you imagine a life like that? And this is why people can't say what is the exact number of these Native Americans that died. So we have talked about basically the positive impacts and the negative impacts, and then now your learning activity one, which is due on Wednesday of this week, which is the 15th, at 2 p.m. is to create your newsletter, right? And I have explained this in a previous session, and this is the instructions here, and you also have samples of the newsletter. Your newsletter is at least 1 page long. Be creative, add pictures, Google pictures, guys. You can create your own pictures, include information, because a newsletter has to be. It's like if you're reading a newspaper and you know what is that you're gonna be reading, all right? So I expect you guys to submit this on Wednesday by the deadline, and then that will be it. I will also be seeing you guys on Wednesday at 8 o'clock for our session. All right. So enjoy your day, guys, and have a safe and blessed Christmas.